The year is 2004. Wind Waker for GameCube and the last proper 2D Zelda game, not counting Four Swords that released on the Game Boy Advance with a port of Link to the Past, released 3 years ago prior for the Game Boy Color. Flagship, now merged with Capcom, was tasked with making a new Zelda game, with Vati making his return from Four Swords as the main villain. This game is known as The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap. As of today, it released 15 years ago, but how well does it hold up today? For the most part, Minish Cap plays as most other 2D Zelda games would, such as Link to the Past. It's a top-down action-adventure game where you go around dungeons collecting items, beating bosses, and the works. It's a very traditional Zelda game, but there's also a gimmick this time around. Rather than that thing on Link's head just being a lifeless cap, Link's hat this time around is an elderly man cursed to be a sort of bird-like hat. He serves as your obligatory partner that's been around most of the Zelda games following Ocarina of Time. What he brings to the table is allowing you to take on Minish size with basically cracks around the world, either in tree trunks or vases or the like. This really helps to bring a new twist on both environments and a couple of old enemies, such as the Choo-Choo and Octorok respectively. Little ponds become vast oceans that you have to navigate, and a couple of dungeons are centered completely around this concept. You're also able to enter in a few nukes around the world, and there's a small quest you have to do with library books and overall navigation. A few other mechanics of note are grabbing onto shrooms to propel yourself across places, a gust jar that sucks up dust and can draw on the aforementioned mushrooms, a cape that actually allows you to jump and glide, and mole mitts to dig through earth. The other items are more or less series staples like the lantern, Pegasus boots, Ocarina of Wind, bow, boomerang, etc, etc. Very early on, however, you gain the White Sword, which brings over the Four Swords mechanic from the game and allows you to duplicate yourself into several links. Of course, since this is a single-player game, the clones simply follow your movements and you have to carefully navigate so that they don't intercept other objects, which causes it to become broken. Thankfully, each one is also capable of attacking, so you can actually make a wall of links to attack enemies, and it actually plays a role in the final boss fight. You can also learn sword techniques from masters throughout the game, a sort of carryover from Wind Waker. Bottles also make a return with the usual stuff you'd come to expect, like potions, milk, and fairies. One noteworthy addition is Pico Light, although I never really found myself using it personally. One can be carried at a time, it lasts for 30 seconds after consuming, and it allows you to increase the rate of finding certain objects depending on which one you consume. They all cost 100 rupees though, so they're pretty pricey, but the yellow one increases the rate of rupees, so it might be worth the investment if you can find more than 100 in 30 seconds. The enemies largely run the gambit of old Zelda enemies such as Like-Likes, Floor Masters, Keys, P-Hats, Deku Scrubs, etc, etc, etc. One notable addition is puff stools. They're basically invincible until you use the aforementioned gust jar to suck all the pollen out of them, after which they'll be vulnerable to attack. There's also a very interesting boss that takes place on massive mana rays flying through the sky, and it proved to be pretty challenging too. One new mechanic is fusing kinstones and is actually required in some circumstances, but is generally just an optional thing to get access to things like heart pieces. Of note is that there is one you need to do before accessing the City in the Clouds if you want to get the light arrow, but that's not really a required item either. However, it'll be unavailable once you cross that point, so be aware if you want to be a completionist about it. You can also randomly find mystery shells that you trade in for a percentage chance of getting figurines depending on how many you spend, but that's just a nice little side thing that mostly gives you some collectibles and a heart piece. I can see how people can see those two things as just mindless filler, but it's mostly optional with only a couple of mandatory golden kinstone fusions, so it's easy to ignore. All in all, I think the gameplay is very nice for a Zelda game. It captures all of the essential elements from previous games and adds a few bells and whistles of its own. The Minish element certainly adds a new dynamic to environments and makes things you'd ordinarily not see as a threat to dominating horrors. If you're itching for some 2D Zelda action, or just some Zelda action in general and you haven't already played it, this is a great entry for indulging that. The plot derives heavily off of Four Swords, so there's no Ganondorf here. It starts off with Link sleeping in his bed, just like in Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. Due to the game's more lighthearted nature, it derives more from the latter as Link's awakened by his blacksmith grandfather who informs them that he's tasked with making a delivery to Hyrule Castle, a sword functioning as a prize to the winner of a sword fighting contest. Princess Zelda, who is apparently a childhood friend of Link in this game, leads the way there. The next beat kinda reminds me a bit of the festival in Chrono Trigger, as Zelda is captivated by several things in the festival while you're there. As the two of you look around at this festival, Zelda apparently wins some kind of game and has her choice between a heart piece, a big rupee, or a shield. Despite the standouter's pretty funny protest, she picks the shield and gives it to you, thinking you can use it to protect her. It's a really nice gesture, and it comes in use immediately as Link has to use it to deflect a Deku Scrub's nuts, something you'll instantly pick up on if you've ever played Ocarina of Time. As the ceremony is underway, it seems the winner not only gets the sword from earlier, but gets to lay a hand on the precious Force Sword that sealed away great evil. The winner turns out to be none other than Vati, who immediately reveals his ulterior motives for whatever reason and blows away the guards. Link tries to protect Zelda, but is knocked unconscious, with Zelda herself being turned to stone in the process. Vati proceeds to break the Force Sword and unleashes a ton of wicked spirits, but seems to be disappointed at this, apparently expecting more as he makes his exit. Link comes to, with the king explaining the situation. The Picori, also known as Minish, have a doorway into their world that opens once every 100 years, but they only appear to children. Bearing this in mind, the king sends Link in place of the soldiers. I kind of like this explanation because at least the game bothers explaining why it sent a child in place of an entire army. In any case, Link makes it to the Minish Woods and rescues Eslo, the bird cat mentioned earlier, from a couple of Octoroks attacking him for no good reason. After being annoyed by Link's walking speed, he plants himself on Link's head and uses his magic to shrink Link to enter the village. However, Link doesn't know their language, so they appear to just be Pokemon saying Picori over and over again. Luckily, in this world, all you have to do to understand them is shove one of their nuts in their mouth, and yes, you heard that right, and yes, I am aware of the double entendre. Whatever the case, you speak with a village elder who informs you that you need the 4 elements to restore the Force Sword completely. After getting the first one, Link makes his way to the mountains where the Minish blacksmith agrees to repair the Force Sword and asks Link to grab the second element while he's busy doing that. Since Link doesn't really have anything better to do, he obliges. After a crazy trip of minecarts and just flipping stuff over and floating over banks of lava, he gets the second element and the white sword is restored. In what's going to be a reoccurring theme for the remaining elements, Link has to make his way into the sanctuary and, I guess, pray the elements into the sword. With that, he can now clone himself into 2 Links, but the Force Sword is clearly only half as strong as it can be since it only has 2 of the 4 elements in it. While Link is still searching for the other 2 elements, Vati mind controls the king just like Jafar from the Sultan from Aladdin. After getting the Pegasus boots from a shoemaking process, Link goes to the Fortress of Winds only to find out that the wind element is now gone. It seems that the people of the Fortress of Wind relocated and took their element with them, so all you find there is the Ocarina of Wind, which functions just like it does in Link to the Past. There isn't really anything you can do about it now, so you have to move on to the Temple of Droplets where you can get the water element, going through a pretty lengthy side quest to get the power bracelet and then later water flippers. After that, he has to make his way through a graveyard on his way to get to the people in the sky to get the wind element from the Palace of Winds at last. With the Force Sword finally fully restored, Link is capable of reviving Zelda and anyone else who was turned to stone by Vati, but he has to fight through the Dark Hyrule Castle first. It's very reminiscent of Link to the Past, and you have to fight your way through until Vati's about to start the ceremony to suck out Zelda's Force Light, which is obviously her soul, to acquire her power. Because of this, you have to hurry before the bell strikes 3 times. The first 2 may be scripted, but if you don't beat those iron knuckles quickly enough, the third will strike on an invisible timer and you will lose automatically in a non-standard game over, so be quick about it. Once you've gotten through all that, you still have to fight through Vati and get to Zelda herself. After finally freeing her from the stone and finishing out Vati for good after fighting him at least twice, Eslo bestows the cap that Vati stole onto Zelda to wish all the horrors to be undone. It's a convenient little plot device that Vati used to become a powerful sorcerer in the first place and can grant wishes. It's good to know the Minish have the ability to essentially create Triforces. Apparently Zelda's righteousness along with the Light Force power is so great that it even manages to bring back the dead, as it brings back everyone who was killed by Vati and restores everything to normal. That may be a little too convenient, but it is a toon-styled Zelda game, so I guess it would clash with the lighthearted tone if they allowed Vati to slaughter so many people without a convenient reset button at hand, so I'll accept it. With the curse on Eslo broken, he returns to being an elderly Minish, and as a consolation gift, he gives Link a proper cap, apparently explaining where that came from, and makes his way through the Minish door before it closes off completely. Despite the admittingly pretty contrived way of making it so that everything's just peachy in the end, it was still a pretty good story all the way through. It keeps a general lightheartedness that you would find in something like The Wind Waker, while still reminding you what's at stake and pushing you on. It's fine for what it is, and it's nice to have another Zelda game where Ganondorf isn't the main villain. While he isn't overused to death anywhere near as much as Ridley from the Metroid series is, it's still nice to have another villain that's reoccurring in the Zelda franchise. It's a nice little self-contained lighthearted story that has a lot to add to the Zelda mythos, and overall I'd say it's quite a good story. Just don't expect anything dark like Twilight Princess or Majora's Mask here. This is firmly Toon Link territory. While the game is in 2D much like games of old, it clearly derives its presentation from the more recently released Wind Waker. Link even has his classical vocal quips from the console games. The GBA version of Link to the Past also technically had this, but it actually fits much better here in my opinion. The more cartoony style suits the GBA system limitations very well if you ask me, and much like Wind Waker, it manages to age quite well. The aesthetic also goes well with returning characters such as the Postman from Majora's Mask as well as Anju and Mala. The game also has very bright and lush colors overall, which I'm sure is just as much about making it more visible on a Game Boy Advance's non-backlit screen as it is about being stylistic. It's especially nice seeing things like leaves and flowers in a much more menacing light when you're in Minish form. The Choo-Choo and Octorok are bosses in here, and the greater detail due to being scaled up is also pretty nice to see. The Minish also look appropriately elfish, and it's really nice seeing Deku Scrubs make an appearance here since they seem to be the one species Nintendo has full-on neglected nowadays. Seriously though, Nintendo, why not give a little more love to the Deku Scrub? While the varying areas may seem a little cliche by now, they're nicely varied with each one providing their own themes and even sets of challenges so it doesn't feel too samey. One thing I thought was a little silly though is that you can see Link's shadow when he's floating over the sky like it's just a flat floor. It's a nitpick, but maybe they could have found a way to make the shadow not render in such circumstances, or maybe not, I don't actually know how the engine works. The music tends to be very aesthetically pleasing to listen to as well, with both old themes like Hyrule Castle and Zelda's theme, and new themes like the Minish Village, and they each bring different styles to the table. Each tune sounds very appropriately Zelda-like, and they make great use of the Game Boy Advance's relatively limited sound chip compared to the Super Nintendo. The sounds do sound alright, which probably sounds like a not very sound comment, but I think they're soundly fine. The one noteworthy thing is the aforementioned voice clips put into the game, which helps to give it an atmosphere somewhat similar to the 3D Zeldas. What else can I say here except that Minish Cap is a very pleasing game from both a visual and audio perspective. Your personal mileage may vary on the Wind Waker's aesthetic, but the style is very fitting for a 16-bit 2D game and allows the game to age much more efficiently rather than if they had tried for a more realistic style. It's classic 2D Zelda combined with a much newer Wind Waker, and the two go together like peanut butter and chocolate. The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap is overall a very worthy entry to the series, and while not all the new mechanics are stellar, the Kinstone fusions in particular are definitely padding. The overall experience is very positive. The Minish aspect adds a lot to the table in addition to the usual Zelda elements, and they blend together very effectively. My only other experience with Four Sword is the add-on with Link to the Past for GBA, and since I don't know anyone else with GBAs and Link to the Past for it, I never got past the opening. Minish Cap does a very sound job adapting that kind of plot to a more single-player experience, and Vati makes a pretty compelling villain, all things considered. Honestly, I think it would be nice to see him make a reappearance sometime, not as the Zanta Ganondorf, but as his own standalone villain. I think he's got a lot of potential to be a real menace in a new 3D Zelda game, but that's just me. The mechanic of becoming Minish makes a very interesting addition to Zelda and has become another thing besides transforming into other species from previous Zelda games that I really wish Nintendo would bring back. With all those other aspects that keep reappearing in every single Zelda game, you'd think they'd want to re-implement one of their more creative and still ripe for potential ones. That also goes for the Four Sword cloning, by the way. I think it added a much-needed sense of variety to the puzzles. Basically, with all this rambling, I had a blast playing it. I would highly recommend it to all three of you who are Zelda fans and never got around to actually playing it. Heck, if you're a fan of action-adventure 2D games in general, give it a shot. This is my review of The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap. I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.